So we're going to move from Wordsworth to Samuel Taylor Coleridge today. One of the other architects of the Romantic movement in England. If lyrical ballads is the preface to lyrical ballads is the manifesto of English Romanticism, then this is one of the two architects. Also a member of the Lake Poets, so-called. So within Romanticism, there's a couple of different groups. This man, along with Robert Southey and William Wordsworth and Charles Lamb, Wordsworth, and Coleridge are the Lake Poets. Associated, that's almost going to go off the table. Associated strongly with the landscape in which Wordsworth is writing. So chiefly the northwest of England, area called Cumbria, the Lake District. There's a mountain range that goes right down the spine of Britain, the Pennines, and on the west of that, and to the north of Manchester and Liverpool and that built up industrial area, it's a national park now. It was not in Wordsworth's time. It became one because of, as much as anything, Wordsworth's writing. It was area of natural beauty, and the whole idea of preserving nature from human civilization took root in this period. And in part, the idealization of nature and the need to preserve it unspoiled, which has an influence in our day in the Romantic or the environmentalist movement. Unprecedented historically, but becomes a reality there in the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution and concerns about what human beings are doing to the world. At any rate, Coleridge is, as we said, Wordsworth's contemporary. He's also his dear friend. They have a famous friendship and a famous falling out at that. Wrote The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, as we'll see. Probably his most famous poem. And others were companion poems to Wordsworth lyrical ballads, lyrical ballads, and tended towards the supernatural. So if Wordsworth focuses on the natural and gives it a supernatural significance, Coleridge does the opposite. He describes supernatural personages like ghosts and so forth, and puts them in a natural landscape. But they come at the things, two sides of the same coin. And he'll explain that in his Biographia Literaria. He'll talk about that. Now, we'll come to that a little bit later on. Coleridge is also, unlike Wordsworth, Coleridge is a far more philosophical thinker. He's also a great literary critic. Was prone to bouts of anxiety and depression. Also had the unfortunate addiction to opium, which he took as a painkiller. He didn't do it to get high. It was prescribed as a laudanum, was prescribed as a painkiller. He suffered pain, so they gave him opium, a derivative of opium, very common in the day to deal with the pain, and he became addicted to it, and he couldn't kick it, for which he was much ashamed, and to some degree became a pitiable figure. But he was, despite that, also considered one of the great intellectuals of his day, and he would pack rooms with people to hear his lectures. And he lectured, and he is one of the people that was, in fact, if not the person chiefly responsible for making Shakespeare the great figure of literary merit that he's regarded as in our day. So in Shakespeare's own age, he was highly regarded. In the 18th century, somewhat, but Coleridge's lectures on Shakespeare made him the undisputed great. And so, as I said, I think last time, Coleridge's criticism of Wordsworth, for all that it hurt Wordsworth, when he said that Wordsworth, despite his defects, which he'll enumerate, is the great writer of our day, and there have been no greater since Milton, besides Wordsworth, than it. If this is your critic, you could not have a better friend as well than somebody who you regard as a harsh critic who praises you for your poetic gifts. Yeah, I won't get into his biography in too much detail, but he was the son of a Unitarian minister, so denied the Trinity, and really so then a product of the Enlightenment, very much of the rationalist era. When he writes the lyrical ballads and his contributions to it, so his early poetry, which is most of his poetry, I should say that as well. He writes a lot of poetry early on, and maybe because he regards Wordsworth as his superior, maybe, who knows why. He doesn't write as much poetry as he could have. And I think he rated himself less highly than he should have, because what we have from his poetry is quite brilliant. But with that being said, he moved away from writing poetry and wrote all sorts of other things, largely literary criticism, but also even delved into politics and so forth. He wrote something called the Statesman's Manual, trying to encourage, like Luther did, letters to a Christian nation, to the noblemen. He wrote the same sort of thing alongside the Biographia Literaria, trying to encourage the noble men, the aristocracy of the country, to observe Christian duties and to educate, disseminate Christian truth, etc. At that point, he became more of a Trinitarian Christian. So this is around 20 years later, after the lyrical ballads. So he moves from, I'd say, a heretical Christian position towards a Trinitarian position. Without a doubt, one of the greatest intellects in English letters. Reads in multiple languages, goes to Germany and acquaints himself with the philosophers of the day. For good or for ill, he is the one who brought Kantian philosophy to the English-speaking world, for which he was derided in his day. The English did not take well to German metaphysics and disparaged Coleridge for it, and he also brought the higher criticism with him to some degree of the Bible. So he's very much influenced by the German-speaking world at a time when Germany is not very important in the European landscape of things. France is, Germany not so much. But it becomes dominant in the 19th century, and Coleridge is the vehicle for that. So he influences Thomas Carlyle and Emerson in the United States, and so a very, very influential figure. And he is the one who gives the sort of the romantic definition of the imagination. I'll come to that in a couple of classes. And then I'll give you my take on what he's doing there and whether it actually does represent the romantic position or not. But that is Coleridge in a nutshell. The poems we're going to look at are his early so-called conversation poems. And they're sort of distinctive, and they give him a very quiet voice. You can see the Wordsworth's emphasis on silence echoed in Coleridge in these poems. Oh, I should put them on the screen here. Bingo? Yes. What does that do? Oh, that does not do well. How do I get rid of this? I'm not sure I can. Anyway, I'll just amplify it a little bit so it's visible. These poems, unlike Wordsworth's poems, which seem to be monologues, are directed to someone. In this case, to his beloved Sarah Hutchinson. And so there's a difference between the two men in this sense. Coleridge seems to be very conversational, though he is also made much fun of because he drones on and on in lectures. But people flock to hear him. Like when he has a lecture series, the halls are packed out. But he drones on and on and on. So goes the critique at any rate, which is fun. The first poem is called the Aeolian Harp. Now let me, what did I want to do? I wanted to play the sound of an Aeolian harp. I don't know if it will pick it up on this, but I'm going to try this. Anyways, that's enough of that. The Aeolian Harp is the title of the poem, and it is a literal harp. Aeolus is the god of the winds in Greek literature. And the harp here, here it's literally a harp, but often it can just be a box that the wind blows through, and it has strings, and the blowing through it makes the noise. And it's often used as a figure in the 18th century of inspiration, natural inspiration. And so it becomes a figure for the poet himself. The poet is moved. It's a way of dealing with the issue of inspiration. And it appeals to, so in my lit theory class, we've talked about mimetic views of poetry. And we talked about here, in relation to Wordsworth writing against neoclassicism, the idea of imitating, and there being classical works and subject matters and so forth for poetry suitable. There's a movement in the late 18th century, certainly expressed here in the poem and in the lyrical ballads, of trying to appeal to a better source of poetry than that of imitating the world past. And that is to I think in sync with more of a progressive political view. So we're not bound by the past. We are in sync with the will of God, if you will, the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. And the poet's the one who articulates that. And how does the poet gain his inspiration? He gains it from nature. And so the Aeolian harp is a representation, that's an emblem of that process of inspiration, where the spirit or the wind moves the poet to express himself. So where does it come from? Remember, in the 18th century, there's a lot of deism, and I mentioned that Coleridge was a Unitarian, and they don't want to appeal to God, but they want to nonetheless appeal to some sort of extra personal means of inspiration, and the wind is it. And so you'll often see in romantic poetry, and Wordsworth's Prelude is one of the best illustrations of this. He talks about the breeze, and so whenever the breeze is mentioned, and then he talks about a correspondent breeze within him, he's imagining himself as an Aeolian harp. I'm not going to do the Prelude in this class, but if you read that epic of Wordsworth's, the influence of the correspondent breeze within is important, and this is the figure that's being referred to. And so it's again the Romantics are writing post-Enlightenment and against the Enlightenment, and yet they largely assume the presuppositions of the Enlightenment. They're no longer adhering to Christian orthodoxy. They're not appealing, as Milton did, to God for inspiration, the Holy Spirit. They will appeal to spiritual inspiration, but that tends to often be in the form of wind. which I hear echoed in contemporary evangelical choruses as well, which drives me insane. Naturalistic, reductionistic, anti-Christian, often. Not even aware of it. And so there's a tendency to literalism in evangelicalism, which is deeply problematic. It doesn't read Scripture well at all. The Romantics are very much concerned with literalism and reductionism, but they don't escape it. They just put the supernatural in the natural. That doesn't escape the problem. They tend to collapse the two, the supernatural and the natural as well. And so they produce a pantheism. And so one of the really interesting books which you might want to look at if you're looking for a critic of Coleridge, by Thomas McFarland, Coleridge and the Pantheist Tradition. Big, fat volume. I've heard McFarland speak at Durham many years ago. And he thinks that his thesis is basically that Coleridge is very much motivated by the desire to escape Spinoza's pantheism. And this pushes him towards Christianity because he realizes that Spinoza is effectively an atheist and he doesn't like that. And the Unitarianism doesn't allow him to escape that. So it impels him in a certain direction. But pantheism is one of the great dangers of the 18th and 19th century, and of our day for that matter. C.S. Lewis mentions it, by the way, in Mere Christianity, Book 2, Section 1. Talks about ways of explaining good and evil. And pantheism presents good and evil as two sides of the same coin. And it's just a matter of perspective. And Lewis calls it damned nonsense. Literally. It's damned in the sense it's demonic. But it is characteristic of much of the Romantic period. They have a great difficulty explaining good and evil or distinguishing them, and they take a great deal of interest in evil. And some of them really go down that path, but we're not at those gentlemen yet. We'll get to the Satanic School later on. That's Byron and Shelley and company. This, though, is dealing with the issue of inspiration, which is a genuine topic of interest for all poets historically. You know, where does the inspiration come from to write? Because I know that it's not just from me. And so in the classical age, you appeal to a muse, a goddess, a higher power to inspire the poetry that you're going to write, because you don't delude yourself into thinking that as a human being what you say is going to be of any significance, because you have enough humility to recognize that you're as limited as the person next to you. So there has to be an appeal to something higher. And even the Romantics do that. It's only our contemporaries that don't appeal to any god except themselves. Which is partly why the poetry is so abominably bad, often. Anyway, the Aeolian Harp, let me read it, and maybe I'll go through the whole thing and then we'll backtrack a bit. But the Aeolian Harp, but again he addresses it directly to his beloved Sarah. My pensive Sarah, thy soft cheek. Listen to the softness of the poetry as well. The sounds are soft, just like the Aeolian Harp we listen to. My pensive Sarah, thy soft cheek reclined thus on mine arm. Most soothing sweet it is to sit beside our cot overgrown with white flowered jasmine and the broad-leaved myrtle, meet emblems they of innocence and love. And watch the clouds that late were rich with light, slow saddening round, and marked the star of eve serenely brilliant. Such should wisdom be, shine opposite. How exquisite the sense snatched from yon bean field, and the world so hushed. The stilly murmur of the distant sea tells us of silence. And the simplest lute, placed lengthways in the clasping casement. Casement is a window frame. Hark! How by the desultory breeze caressed, like some coy maid half yielding to her lover, it pours such sweet upbraiding as must needs tempt to repeat the wrong. And now its strings boldly are swept, the long sequacious notes over delicious surges sink and rise, such a soft floating witchery of sound as twilight elfins make, when they at eve voyage on gentle gales from fairyland, where melodies round honey-dripping flowers, footless and wild like birds of paradise, nor pause nor perch, hovering on untamed wing. Oh, the one life within us and abroad, which meets all motion and becomes its soul, a light in sound, a sound-like power in light, rhythm in all thought, and joyance everywhere. Methinks it should have been impossible not to love all things in a world so filled, where the breeze warbles and the mute, still air is music slumbering on her instrument. And thus, my love, as on the midway slope of yonder hill I stretch my limbs at noon, whilst through my half-closed eyelids I behold the sunbeams dance, like diamonds on the main, and tranquil muse upon tranquility, full many a thought uncalled and undetained, and many idle, flitting fantasies traverse my indolent and passive brain, as wild and various as the random gales that swell and flutter on this subject lute. And what if all of animated nature be but organic harps diversely framed, and tremble into thought, as o'er them sweeps plastic and vast one intellectual breeze, at once the soul of each and God of all? Heretical thought. Sarah is an Orthodox Christian, just context. So, but thy more serious eye a mild reproof darts, O beloved woman. This is in him saying, okay. Nor such thoughts dim and unhallowed dost thou not reject, and biddest me walk humbly with my God, meek daughter in the family of Christ. Well hast thou said, and holily dispraised these shapings of the unregenerate mind, bubbles that glitter as they rise and break on vain philosophy's babbling spring. For never guiltless may I speak of him, the incomprehensible, save when with awe I praise him, and with faith that inly feels, who with his saving mercies healed me, a sinful and most miserable man, wildered and dark, and gave me to possess peace, and this cot, and thee, heart-honored maid. So, 64 lines, the Aeolian Harp, regularly dabbles in the idea of pantheism, that there's a one life within us and abroad. The idea of the witchery of sound this phrase, the one life within us and abroad that meets all motion, becomes its soul, a light and sound, a sound like power and light, rhythm in all thought and joyance everywhere. You could have taken that from Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey. He talks about this emotion and a spirit that imbues all things, same sort of sentiment. And one that was being entertained by both men at the same time. Now, Coleridge was older than Wordsworth. He was at Cambridge before Wordsworth. He left Cambridge in a rather disgraced fashion. I won't go into that, but he left it to join the army in Malta. His brothers had to buy him out of it. Not quite sure how that came about. But this idea of the Aeolian harp as a figure of poetic inspiration is one that he finds very appealing, and which his contemporaries do as well. So they regularly appeal to the Aeolian harp. It's helpful. It's not much mentioned in our day, and I haven't actually seen people, for all of their wind chimes in Toronto and their whatever spirit catchers. There aren't many. I haven't heard Aeolian harps, but it's a similar sort of idea. Wind blowing, spiritual power, connected with nature, associated with something greater than nature. Not attributing it to gods, but more to a god in things, like as in Aeolus, the wind god. But the figure of nature having this supernatural power, very common trope of the period. Recognized as heretical in the day. And recognized even by Coleridge within the context of his own poem. And so his beloved Sarah upbraids him, at least with a raised eyebrow for what he says. And he's probably had this conversation with her before, and she knocks him into shape, and he corrects himself and is happy to rest content with it. Having said that, does he really repent of his ways? I mean, he does, but he keeps going back to it at this period. Struggling with it. Again, he's the son of a Unitarian minister. He doesn't have a Trinitarian view of God, and therefore doesn't really have a way of combating the rationalism of his day. He's trying to do it with an appeal to the supernatural. Because the problem with rationalism is it reduces everything to what you can see. And he knows that this is wrong. He knows there's more to it than that. So how do I explain that it's not just the material world? No one has ever thought such a stupid thing as materialism. That's a 19th century dumb belief that is really anti-intellectual to the core. And he doesn't buy it. He knows there's something more than this. The realm of ideas are not empirical objects, but he thinks that there is truth and beauty and goodness and justice and so forth. So where do these ideas come from? His contemporaries will say they come from the human brain. So Shelley will conclude that. Coleridge will not do that. He will go in a different direction. But so there's a shift in there, and she note that there, although it's called a conversation poem, he speaks on her behalf, and she doesn't speak at all. She just looks at him, and then he responds to her as if she had corrected him, which she probably has outside the context of the poem. Before, we've been through this many times, so now he affirms what she's saying, and even speaks of his unregenerate mind, which is a fascinating thing to say. And again, gives a sense that, and the vain philosophy, the hollow and deceptive vain philosophy that he's articulating here. And she's probably accused him of this. I'm just inferring from the poem, but elsewhere as well, that she's put there. Now, when he articulates this, he speaks of God in terms of the incomprehensible. So then we get into issues that I've raised in class before about how you receive God. Do you see God as as incomprehensible and unknowable, or do you see him as hidden? And there are two traditions. And you get Christian expressions from this one. God is incomprehensible, unknowable, because he's beyond our capacities to grasp. But that tends not to be the Christian position. That's a fringe position. The dominant position is that God hides himself. He's Deus absconditus. And this explains the interaction with the problem of evil. This one is who knows. The hidden one is a little less who knows. And I recall speaking on this last year in relation to C.S. Lewis's The Last Battle, and suggested that he was talking about the dark night of the soul and the last king of Narnia, and yet nonetheless, even though there was no voice, Aslan doesn't appear, and the last king of Narnia is calling for him, and children are calling for him. There's no answer in the midst of their troubles, which is unheard of before that in the children's stories, and now he's getting more to an adult experience. As the children are getting older, it becomes more, it's difficult. God's ways are, in this world are sometimes complicated, and the problem of evil, complex. But that doesn't mean that he's totally unknowable, and that's where he's leaning here. And I think this is still speaking from the unregenerate mind. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on this. He said, with his saving mercies healed me. What do I know? Refers to a personal redemption of some sort, coming to faith. Okay. Well then, but his language is not yet in sympathy with that. Not yet. Anyway, comments or thoughts about this? You can clearly hear the echoes of previous poems. What if all animated nature be but organic harps diversely framed that tremble into thought as o'er them sweeps plastic and vast one intellectual breeze. Shelley loved this idea. He appealed to it regularly. So these poems which we read here became very influential on the subsequent generation as well. Coleridge was particularly loved. Comments or questions? Okay, then let me move on to Frost at Midnight. The frost performs its secret ministry, unhelped by any wind. The owlet's cry came loud, and hark again, loud as before. The inmates of my cottage, all at rest, have left me to that solitude, which suits abstruser musings, save that at my side my cradled infant slumbers peacefully. 'Tis calm indeed, so calm that it disturbs and vexes meditation with its strange and extreme silentness. Sea, hill, and wood, with all the numberless goings-on of life, inaudible as dreams. The thin blue flame lies on my low burnt fire, and quivers not. Only that film which fluttered on the grate still flutters there, the sole unquiet thing. Methinks its motion in this hush of nature gives it dim sympathies with me who live, making it a companionable form, whose puny flaps and freaks the idling spirit by its own mood interprets everywhere, echo of mirror seeking of itself, and makes a toy of thought. So again, he focused on silence, just like, and reading into the silence. But oh, how oft, at school with most believing mind, presageful have I gazed upon the bars to watch that fluttering stranger, and as oft with unclosed lids already had I dreamt of my sweet birthplace and the old church tower, whose bells, the poor man's only music, rang from morn to evening all the hot fair day, so sweetly that they stirred and haunted me with a wild pleasure, falling on mine ear most like articulate sounds of things to come. So gazed I, till the soothing things I dreamt lulled me to sleep, and sleep prolonged my dreams. And so I brooded all the following morn, awed by the stern preceptor's face, mine eye fixed with mock study on my swimming book, save if the door half opened and I snatched a hasty glance, and still my heart leapt up, for still I hoped to see the stranger's face, townsman or aunt or sister more beloved, my playmate when we both were clothed alike. Dear babe, that sleepest cradled by my side, whose gentle breathings heard in this deep calm fill up the interspersed vacancies and momentary pauses of the thought. My babe, so beautiful, it thrills my heart with tender gladness thus to look at thee, and think that thou shalt learn far other lore, and in far other scenes. For I was reared in the great city, pent mid cloisters dim, and saw naught lovely but the sky and stars. But thou, my babe, shalt wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores, beneath the crags of ancient mountain, and beneath the clouds, which image in their bulk both lakes and shores and mountain crags. So shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God utters, who from eternity doth teach himself in all, and all things in himself. Great universal teacher, he shall mold thy spirit, and by giving make it ask. Therefore, all seasons shall be sweet to thee. Whether the summer clothe the general earth with greenness, or the redbreasts sit and sing betwixt the tufts of snow on the bare branch of mossy apple tree, while the nigh thatch smokes in the sun thaw. Whether the eavesdrops fall, heard only in the trances of the blast, or if the secret ministry of frost shall hang them up in silent icicles, quietly shining to the quiet moon. So again, this, I would say, it leans more in the direction of Wordsworth's lyrical ballads, and it presents a supernatural presence in the natural landscape. Now, he does not include these in the lyrical ballads. His lean in the other direction, as I say, supernatural agents and so forth. But this is much more along the lines that Wordsworth's own poetry falls. And note the similar references to silence and quietness, and the idea that nature is a better teacher than the cities and the schools. That nature is a teacher, and God, who created nature, a better teacher than human authorities. So in a sense, there's a whole movement from the Reformation onwards of going, and for that matter, in the humanistic period that precedes it, to go ad fontes, go to the source. And so this is the same call, we'll go to the source, and the source of all inspiration is God himself, and God can be read off the face of nature, which is standard Christian belief, but they would never agree that God can be read unambiguously off the face of nature, or that nature was sufficient for us to understand salvation. You need the Book of Grace to do that. But Coleridge, like all the Romantics, appeals to the book of nature as God's book. So if it is pantheism, it's a very monotheistic type of pantheism. He's not referring to the gods. There's a sense of a unity of the Godhead, and he's not going to move in the direction of the Unitarians, which is very rationalistic and is going to be explicitly opposed to the Trinitarian theology of the Church. This is more directed at the Enlightenment and that sort of movement. You can see why he and Wordsworth would get along, just based on these poems. Comments or questions? I think it's quite they're beautiful poems, and they're not what I normally expect of Coleridge. Coleridge we associate with with the supernatural poems of, as I said, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner or others of its ilk. Nonetheless, who likes the poem? Anyone? Okay. No questions, though. Okay. Then I will move to the third. I think this is the third I said I was going to look at. The Nightingale, is that correct? No, the lime tree bower, my prison. Okay, so let's see, I don't like that website. That's better. So as I say, it's dedicated to Charles Lamb, one of his fellow lake poets. It is this lime tree bower, my prison. Now this is characteristic of Coleridge as well, and you'll notice it's also to some degree characteristic of Wordsworth, this lack of sense of human agency. There's a mind that perceives what's going on around him, but there's no sense of a person interacting with the environment. The environment interacts upon him, just like the Aeolian harp. He's receptive of things around him, and he processes them and writes about them, but it's a corresponding breeze all the time, but you don't get the sense of human agency or of action. There's no action in the poetry in general, certainly not in this period. Later on we will see agents put into Coleridge's poem, but in general the Romantic poetry is very much of an internal world, and that they're passive, and here especially so. But the Aeolian harp already presents the poet as a passive vessel on which the wind blows and creates a sort of harmony. And this likewise. Well, they are gone, and here must I remain, this lime tree bower my prison. I have lost beauties and feelings such as would have been most sweet to my remembrance, even when age had dimmed mine eyes to blindness. They, meanwhile, friends, whom I never more may meet again, on springy heath along the hill-top edge, wander in gladness, and wind down, perchance, to that still roaring dell, of which I told. The roaring dell, o'er-wooded, narrow, deep, and only speckled by the midday sun. So it's a deep cataract, water that goes down into it. Where its slim trunk the ash from rock to rock flings, arching like a bridge, that branchless ash, unsunned and damp, whose few poor yellow leaves ne'er tremble in the gale, yet tremble still, fanned by the waterfall. And there, my friends, behold the dark green file of long, lank weeds, that all at once, most fantastic sight, still nod and drip beneath the dripping edge of the blue clay stone. Now note that he's imagining all this. Now, my friends emerge beneath the wide heaven, and view again the many-steepled tract, magnificent of hilly fields and meadows, and the sea, with some fair bark, perhaps, whose sails light up the slip of smooth, clear blue betwixt two isles of purple shadow. Yes, they wander on in gladness all. But thou, methinks, most glad, my gentle-hearted Charles, for thou hast pined and hungered after nature many a year, in the great city pent, winning thy way with sad yet patient soul through evil and pain and strange calamity. Ah, slowly sink beneath the western ridge, thou glorious sun. Shine in the slant beams of the sinking orb, ye purple heath flowers. Richlier burn, ye clouds. Live in the yellow light, ye distant groves. And kindle thou, blue ocean. So my friend, struck with deep joy, may stand, as I have stood, silent with swimming sense, yea, gazing around on the wild landscape. Gaze till all doth seem less gross than bodily, and of such hues as veil the Almighty Spirit, when yet he makes spirits perceive his presence. A delight comes sudden on my heart, and I am glad as I myself were there, nor in this bower, this little lime tree bower. Have I not marked much that has soothed me? Pale beneath the blaze hung the transparent foliage, And I watched some broad and sunny leaf, and loved to see the shadow of the leaf and stem above dappling its sunshine. And that walnut tree was richly tinged, and a deep radiance lay full on the ancient ivy, which usurps those fronting elms, and now with blackest mass makes their dark branches gleam a lighter hue through the late twilight. And though now the bat wheels silent by, and not a swallow twitters, yet still the solitary humble bee sings in the bean flower. Henceforth I shall know that nature ne'er deserts the wise and pure. No plot so narrow be but nature there. No waste so vacant but may well employ each faculty of sense and keep the heart awake to love and beauty. So there's a lesson from all this. And sometimes 'tis well to be bereft of promised good, that we may lift the soul and contemplate with lively joy the joys we cannot share. My gentle Charles, when the last rook beat its straight path along the dusky air homewards, I blessed it, deeming its black wing, now a dim speck, now vanishing in light, had crossed the mighty orb's dilated glory, while thou stoodst gazing, or when all was still, flew creaking o'er thy head, and had a charm for thee, my gentle-hearted Charles, to whom no sound is dissonant which tells of life. So note in all three poems, they're companion poems, and they're addressed to somebody, and there's a communion of minds suggested, even though there's no conversation partner. But it's speaking to somebody who he knows is in sympathy with his thoughts. And the reason he knows they're in sympathy is because they've had conversations before. They share his viewpoint here. And that sense of a sympathy in another person is important to the sympathy which he also sees in the natural landscape. And again, the nature is capitalized here, and it does have a sense of a divine power in the world that we will call nature. Now, this sense of nature is, again, the Romantics' own invention. It's their own sense of nature. I directed you to C.S. Lewis's Studies in Words and his entry on nature. I think it's the second entry. It goes on for 50, 60 pages and shows that the Romantics' notion of nature, in the sense of a good power, is unprecedented in human history. It's not the biblical sense of nature. It's not the Stoic sense of nature. It's not any sense. It's their invention. And so along with the imagination, I think we also need to attend to the sense that they give to nature, which I think we still hold of it. When I say we, I mean our contemporaries. From it comes the dark green environmental movement, which sees human beings as a stain upon the earth, or like a virus that needs to be eradicated, carbon footprints and all that stuff. In which they're not making a reference to the vehicles, but even to breathing. You're a carbon unit producing carbon, which is a natural element and part of what is necessary for the whole ecosystem anyway, because the green things feed off the carbon. The carbon dioxide that you breathe out is useful to your plants. But here the nature is personified, and yet, in a sense, not localized. It's everywhere. So in that sense, it is like God. Nature ne'er deserts the wise and pure. No plot so narrow be but nature there. No waste so vacant, but may well employ each faculty of sense and keep the heart awake to love and beauty. But he presents the lime tree bower as his prison because he has no agency to move outside it, and yet what's active in him is his imagination, which is flitting about everywhere, imagining him where his companions are because he's directed them there. He may be sick as usual, like physically infirm and not able to walk, possible. The poor man suffered very poor health for decades, so that's possible. And yet he imagines himself with his companions, and one companion in particular he dedicates the poem to and refers to him at the beginning and then again at the end. And so, as I say, this is the basis for his great friendship, is he has a community of minds, even in their absence. Charles Lamb, very interesting fellow. I'm not going to look at him on this course, but he and his wrote tales from Shakespeare. Charles and Mary took Shakespearean plays and condensed them in forms for children. So very interesting. I haven't seen much interest in that anymore, but it would take Shakespeare's tales and present them in a children's literature form. Did she? Yeah. I've got one at home. I haven't read them to my kids. What do you think? What did you think of them?
I liked them because I think it made it easier, obviously.
It would make it easier when you come to Shakespeare, for sure.
For sure. But I just think it's really cool, condensing such complex stories.
Yeah, not easy. Takes a great literary gift to do that, at least to do it well. And there is a tendency, which I don't think they are prone to Bowdlerizing, which is to get rid of all the dirty stuff. Pruning Shakespeare so he's, less suggestive. Anyway, this is for children, so people aren't quite as harsh. When you do it for adults, then people say, "Oh, come on." Anyway, that is the final one, which I said I would look at in terms of the companion poems. You can see a commonality to them. Reference to nature in a supernatural sense, I think, associated with a quietness and yet a potency despite that quietness, and a comprehensiveness working through the frost, working through the wind. The gentle, favored text of the period is when the prophet Elijah is after the great face-off with the prophets of Baal, right? In which he calls down fire from heaven, and then he falls into a bout of depression and flees, which is an extraordinary thing after such a magnificent demonstration of the power of God. You would have thought he would not be depressed, but he is. And when Jezebel says, I'm going to kill you, he is terrified, flees, and God comforts him, and he hears him not in the earthquake or in the thunderstorm, but he hears him in his still small voice. That translation, the authorized version, King James, the still small voice. Here's a still small voice. All the time they refer to that. Sounds like God speaks in low tones. You just have to listen. Certainly not a dominant feature of the Christian tradition, but maybe more in the monastic tradition of, being silent and listening. This morning I talked about Augustine's On Christian Doctrine, and we talked about the importance of the images of the ear and words. But this is not words. This is the images of the ear and silence. Not the same thing at all. Still an appeal to the ear. But in a sense, Coleridge and I would say the apophatic tradition, there's a word for you, the Hesychia of the Eastern Orthodox, the importance placed on silence. So Coleridge's poetry appeals to the Russian Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox. It's strong emphasis on, as I say, the apophatic, the non-articulated. very popular than the Romantics with also Eastern religions, where there's a similar, the contemplative, or an idea with mindfulness. For which there's something to be said for not being so busy, and a time of contemplation, very important aspect of the Christian tradition. But in the Christian tradition, it's reading the Word and meditating on the Word, not meditating on silence. When I meditate on silence, I hear my own words, and that's not very helpful. I have my own thoughts. I don't want those thoughts. Let me fill my mind with God's words rather than my own, because things come rushing in when you're sitting there silently, which are usually not very helpful. But there is certainly a tradition for that, and in some monastic practices, even a vow of silence. So pushing in this direction of the importance of silence as a way of hearing God, and by drowning or by cutting out the cacophony of noise that comes from the busyness of the world. Anyway, comments or questions? I'm going to leave it at that today. It's short. It works. Next time, we shall move to two poems. That's why I don't want to do them right now, because they don't really fit. Kubla Khan and Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. We'll spend a fair bit of time on this. You'll see in Kubla Khan a fragment poem. I'll talk about the significance of the fragment poem. I've already hinted at it when I talked about Tintern Abbey being a ruin. Right? So there's something that's been destroyed by nature, and a power in the absence of the wholeness there, and the poem is the same sort of thing. So in this period, there's a lot of fragments, unfinished poetry. And you say, well, can they not finish something they've started? And the answer is they intentionally leave it fragmentary because it signifies something. I'll say more about that next time. But it's in the same vein of the sublime. Okay, we'll do that then.